Welcome to Lean Agile Management Podcast, a show by Kanbanize that helps you boost work efficiency, create culture of high performance, and build teams that thrive. Welcome to the lab. Today on the show.
Could it be that the most of the modern project management issues have just one main root cause? What do brain surgeries and lean have in common? Today we'll shine the light on the very core problem of modern work culture and look for specific lean solutions. Our special guest today is Steve Tendon, a management consultant, business advisor, and author. Steve is the creator of Tame Flow Approach and the managing director at Tame Flow Consulting Limited, where he helps organizations and teams reach new levels of performance. Hi, Steve. Welcome on the show.
Hi, and welcome to everybody who's going to listen to us for the next 20-25 minutes. Be glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm glad we could make this and you could have the time for this. So maybe to get some context for our listeners, could we start from learning a bit more about you? So what was the first team that you've ever helped, maybe? Could you share either the main challenge that they've had or something about them that you first helped solve them? A consultant or coach in terms of lean and agile, like as you said, you started from extreme programming, so maybe in that context.
Well, I would roll back even a few years before the extreme programming, because it was shortly after I had left Poland, and at that time I was in Switzerland doing banking applications. What else could you do in Switzerland? Maybe finding chocolate or looking at Google clocks.
Right.
So it was a banking application, and it was in a startup. So a very small, tightly knit team, which was on a very very tight deadline. It was all shaping up to become one of those dreaded death marches. And that was the first time I was really fully responsible for a team. So I could do basically what I wanted in terms of how to organize the work. Maybe the major thing that I did differently was this notion that eventually was picked up or described in extreme programming, that I would have like the developers and myself sitting literally on the same side of the table with the business people, those that have the ideas in their heads, and that allowed to cut out of the process many formalities, lots of documentation, lots of checkpoints and milestones, and things just sped up incredibly. I really hate, the metrics of lines per code. It doesn't mean anything, but nonetheless, at the time, it was significant. And comparing that kind of output or production metrics with what was happening in other places. That team was like order of magnitudes much more productive. So it was like the first time I could apply the teaching side I had brought with me from the time of Poland, and the first time I could actually see a positive impact, a really good result on using basically those ideas, because it was not a methodology, it was not an approach, not a framework.
Mm-hmm.
This experience and gut feeling of what should be the right thing to do.
Right. That's actually an interesting point that you've made there. I keep hearing people say that when people talk about lean and all the similar methods, philosophies, and all these tools that we have, people keep coming back and saying, well, that's actually common sense. That's how it was supposed to be done from the beginning. And that's interesting that I keep hearing this thought that people just know what's right. They have this gut feeling, but yeah, somehow we stick to the funny metrics that mess us up.
I think that aspect, the common sense aspect, is also something that when you start going around and teach companies how to work better, in hindsight they say, well, that's common sense. And your natural reaction, well, if it was common sense, why did you not apply it? What is that artificial impedance mismatch that is always present in most companies? And that, so if you start thinking about that question, what is like the big thing that is always wrong everywhere, you might go in some interesting directions.
Okay, so maybe let's take it. That's a strong point, because there are many people blame lots of different things for their failures. People used to say it's all about human factor, or there was for a long time there was this culture of blame laying. Right now, I hope we see a shift from that with first Agile and then Lean and the mixes of all sorts. But what would be, in your opinion and in your view, the most burning, hot, or painful issue of modern project management and teams management, and all? What would be the core issue that we're struggling with right now?
Okay, I'll approach this with the mindset of theory constraints. What I'm trying to apply here is answering the question: what would Goldratt do? Goldratt is Goldratt, the father of theory constraints. And the first step is always that of defining the goal. Where do you want to go? What do you want to achieve? Now, if we try to abstract that in general terms, you would always get to a point where most companies, in one way or another, they are, of course, concerned about performance. Now, I don't want to go into the topic, which is also an interesting one, of how do you measure productivity and Taylorism in industrial way of thinking. Because, by the way, I think many observations there are not really quite well thought out. But I just put that aside and say, if you start focusing on performance, you will see that there are certain things that are positive with performance. For instance, in many places, because of market pressure, people are definitely overworked. They have to take over time. And there is always more than one pile of work for each and every one of the people involved. So there is this overwhelming load of work. And of course, if you have performance as a weapon to tackle that, then we could even, in an ideal situation, we could imagine that you're so fast at doing things that, well, you have time to go to the beach and take a swim because the work was done and you have free time. So there are aspects which really impact your personal and individual life as a member of a community which is working together, which we call the company. Now, if you have to then reflect on this, say that the objective is performance. What is it that takes you there? And in my thinking, I have come up with basically three things. The most important one is probably trust. You need to build a community of trust. Of course, if you're distrusting your peers or your co-workers or colleagues, you will spend an enormous amount of energy just fighting internally in the organization rather than trying to fight for the market share or fighting for making a better product or spending time with your customer and clients and understanding. So if you're not able to crack that nut of creating a community of trust, you will never have performance. The other point, which is strictly closely related to this, is that, everybody, not only do they need to trust each other, but they must be rowing in the same direction. Which also is both a consequence and a component of building trust. Of course, if I work for 3 weeks doing something, then someone else comes along and says, no, that was totally wrong, we'll scrap it and do something else, without any real motivation, well, we've wasted a lot of effort, and probably I will start distrusting that person as well. And then the third part is leadership. I use this expression of inspired leadership, which is confusing because most people will understand inspiring leadership. And inspired leadership is something that does not pertain to a conventional leadership role. It's rather the act of leadership that inspires someone to take a standing and perform these acts of leadership. So it could even be the latest hire in the company that sees something that shouldn't be quite that way and takes the initiative to fix it. And is so good at doing it that the rest of the people say, yes, that was good. I'll do the same thereafter. So these three things are like the core of team flow. And going back to your question, I always tend to take a long way to come to to the point. But back to the question, what is it that is really undermining this possibility? Well, after many iterations through many companies and being deeply inspired by zero constraints, my conclusion is it's cost-based accounting. So it goes back to notions that it is how you count money and how you account monies in a company that is the root cause for a number of dysfunctions, and then the negative effects just ripples after that.
Wow, that's a very fresh point and very strong, but doesn't mean like we just blame the money. It's all the money's good.
It's like a paradox because with money you also have this weighing of moral judgment. Of course, there's no motivation to try to justify greed or the sharks that are out there trying to hunt down every possible cent to increase their own personal benefit. This is not about that. It's more about how money is used as a resource in a company to make things happen. It's pretty obvious. But without money, you wouldn't be able to buy your laptop. You wouldn't be able to keep the internet connection running. We wouldn't have this conversation. So it's a resource. And when you start using resources, the next thing you care about is, well, how do I utilize them best? Why? Because they are limited. If we had an infinite amount of money, we wouldn't be concerned. But they are limited. So we need to handle and manage the finances in a responsible way. And this brings to the table this idea of financial responsibility. And I sustain that the practices of conventional accounting are really practices of, as far as we talk about the running of a company, so the management part of the company, are really practices of financial irresponsibility. So I get a lot of feel for that.
That's a very interesting point. And yeah, I can see definitely how that is true, because it also defines the kind of goals company would set, right? And the incentives inside of the team. Yeah, it's a strong point. But then what would be any possible way to tackle that? I mean, we cannot just tell everyone how to deal their resources within the company, and why would anyone listen, right? So how can we make any strong point about solving this issue, or at least bringing it up?
Well, this is where the connection between Lean and TOC becomes a really powerful tool, because with Lean you start thinking about flow in terms of operational flow. By the way, my approach is called team flow because I identified 4 flows. One is the operational flow, the second one is the financial flow, the third one is the informational flow, and the fourth one is the psychological flow. So lean would help a lot in the first one, in the operational flow, and then we have TOC that helps in the operational and in the financial flow. So what I typically do to like bootstrap a positive change is first of all to make people aware that if they want to increase the performance of the organization, they have to start looking at the performance of individuals and look at the whole. So it's the systems thinking approach, and therein we need to figure out ways to maximize the capacity of the system. I actually wrote a couple of blog posts which are up on the company's blog a couple of months ago, I believe, where I tried to illustrate at least the first part of this reasoning, where you want to gain control of the workload in your system, and Kanban gives you an excellent means for doing this, because you will tend to balance the work that you release into the system with the actual capacity that the system is capable of. And the way to bring this forward is to come up with some metaphors to make people appreciate what this is all about. Because when you start saying you have to balance the incoming work with the capacity, and maybe we are in that situation where in order to do this, you have to limit the working process, which in turn means someone somewhere in that work process is standing still. Because that's the nature of limiting working process. You have this immediate reaction, which is driven by the cost accounting mindset that, hey, you cannot stand still. I'm paying your salary. You have to work 8 hours a day.
Right.
So you have that economic pressure to always be busy.
Yeah.
And that is also detrimental, because if for some reason someone is legitimately not busy, you will make things up to appear to be busy, and you have a lot of smoke screens and distorted understanding of what really is going on. But going back to that point, how can you justify that someone needs to be idle and not be working? And the metaphor I often bring up is that of a patient. A patient in a hospital has to be patient, because usually the patient is waiting for the wards, the nurses, the doctors to be available to work on his case.
Yeah.
But the most effective way of handling a patient is really to have the opposite. It's to have all these skilled professionals to be like waiting and available when their need is there. So when you go into the operations theater, they of course they will give you anesthesia, they will put you asleep, and hopefully the doctor will, suppose it's brain surgery, will cut you open. Sorry for the rude or raw expression, but will cut you open immediately after the anesthesia has had its effect. And then the doctor will do his work, and then we'll stick together, and then you'll have the recovery. But imagine if you were like a patient in a conventional company where work is waiting for the worker. You could very well be in the situation where you have gone through anesthesia, and then you would be waiting for the next step. And by the time the doctor comes there and cuts you open, the effect of the anesthesia is gone. And that would be very painful. So that gives you like a vivid image of what it means to get the work, so the patient, to flow through the system, would you rather prefer to be the patient in a hospital where the workers are waiting for the work, or in a hospital where the work is waiting for the workers? I think the former. So there you start gaining this insight that flow has some deep impact, and it will also continue with that metaphor of the hospital. It would also impact the total time we are actually staying in the hospital.
Right.
The less you have to wait in between the states, so the less you have to be patient, the sooner you get out. And in those in between the states, we have a very low-hanging fruit which can be easily exploited. And that brings us to flow efficiency. But why did we get into this reasoning? Well, it was in terms of how we started creating like a unity of purpose and an understanding of we must work together as a team. If you start to have everyone in an organization to appreciate like this metaphor of the patient in the hospital, and you start looking at the work that comes into the organization as a patient, and you start asking the question, what can we do to avoid this work, this patient, to be standing still? Then you will start to develop thoughts and ideas which maybe without knowing all the theory behind it, will allow you to introduce flow in the system. And this then starts creating those situations which run counter to cost accounting, because necessarily you will have people with precious paid resources which are idle. They are standing still waiting for their turn to run forward with the baton, if we want to use the relay race. And that is a very defining moment, because then you start questioning, well, why do we have this paradox that on the one side we want people to always be busy because that is capital efficient and the accountants are happy, but on the other side, as a patient, someone who's experienced, has had a hospital experience, I can very well relate to the benefits for the customer to have idle people. And that's like the start of it. Then from that, I continue with other more sophisticated exercises, like flow efficiency.
Right. But I think everyone who's listening right now has this very vivid image of skull brain and brain surgery being in progress.
That leaves an impact, yes.
Yeah. So I guess that's a wonderful example. It's really strong though, but it has to be like that, I guess, because as you said, it's all coming back to value and what's value for us, how we define it. Because if we say that the value is money, then we're missing the point. We've seen companies many times over and over say, or with their actions show that that's the main reason they're doing things, and then they would lose customers. I've had a conversation recently about the very same thing, when people felt like they've been milked for the very last penny, and they would never come back to that company. They would never get that service again. But if the value is customer, if the value is delivering, like doing what the company is all about, that changes it. And having this value-centered mentality seems to be the solution to so many different other issues, just like you just...
Yes, and I think there is also another lurking conflict that needs to be addressed, especially in the agile space, because for good reasons, people in agile have become very concerned about conventional metrics, and they have developed, rightly so, I would say, an allergy to the word productivity. And by the way, my book also has the word productivity in its title, and it's even worse because it's called hyper productivity. But the intent there in all of my work is not that Tayloristic idea of getting out the whip and just exploit people in the maximum possible way. It goes back to what I said at the beginning here, that performance has benefits for you as a worker, of course, provided that the company understands this philosophy. And related to what you exactly said, the notion of value, performance is always something that gives value to the customer, either directly or indirectly. If you are that patient, of course, you experience that performance as a better service. You're exposed to the perils of the hospital in a shorter time frame. In other instances, you might not have such a direct benefit of performance. For instance, consider companies that deal with innovation that have to create new products and new services. Nowadays, we're using some very experimental approaches like lean startup, where you basically don't know what you're doing. You're finding out what the customer likes and what the customer would pay for. And even that context performance is extremely important, because the faster you can produce an experiment, the faster you will learn, and the faster you will be able to make that final pivot before your startup funds run out. So the notion of with the old word productivity or with performance being something negative because it's tied to exploiting people, I think it's completely superseded and has nothing to do with a contemporary understanding of what performance is really about.
Thanks for sharing it. That sounds really great. And I think we just recap once again the main things that we've said, because
in the quest for creating organizations and teams that are high performers, we need to care about three things, in my opinion. One is that we need unity of purpose. We must not work one against another. We must have a community of trust. We must not have hidden agendas. And we must appreciate inspired leadership, which means active leadership by anyone who's capable to perform that. And we must be very cautious about the most common practices that undermine all of these things. And that has one name. There is one clearly identified enemy, if you wish to use that metaphor, and that is cost accounting. Because cost accounting will hinder the adoption of any kind of flow-inspired method of working. Primarily because idleness cannot be accounted for. It's seen in a negative way. And also because with cost accounting, you lose the vision of the performance of the whole system. And as a matter of fact, with cost accounting, you would tend to slice and dice the organization in as small pieces as possible, and then do cost allocations for this and for that. And at the end, all of these pieces, which are awaiting, take like the budgeting process or awaiting a piece of the budget, well, they will be fighting one against the other, one against another. And that explains why cost accounting, from budgeting to actual measurement of KPIs, is undermining any kind of adoption of flow. The solution is to start to use approaches like lean, but once you have lean, that is necessary, but in my opinion not sufficient, and that is where I think that my combining lean and agile and TOC has huge advantages. Once you have adopted lean, you can get the benefits of throughput accounting by looking at what TOC has been doing. So then combining Lean and TOC, you get something which is more powerful, and in my world, that has a name, and it's called Tendon.
Great. Thank you once again. That's been Steve Tendon, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. Until next time.
The Lamp is brought to you by Kanbanize, the leading Kanban software for lean management. Learn more at kanbanize.com.
If you'd like to keep learning about the topics we've covered in this episode, look for the links and downloadable content in the description to this episode. We'll see you here next time.